for your kind introduction. And it's a big pleasure for me to be here at Korea University, and in more specifically to be able to talk to the Korea University New Economic Thinking Society, which I think is a very useful network for more forward-looking thinking on a variety of issues. So what I'm going to talk today will be based on a research project, right, that we did last year, right? And we produced about 10 research papers for that research project. And those research papers ended up, first of all, as inputs or materials for the Asian Development Outlook 2014. ADO, maybe some of you know it, some of you don't, but in any case, ADO, or Asian Development Outlook, is an annual flagship report. It's published twice a year. The main report comes out in late March, early April, and the update comes out in late September, early October. But in any case, so this presentation I will be making today will be based heavily on the research that we at ABD did for the Asian Development Outlook 2014 special theme chapter. But after we produced the ADO 2014, there was a lot of material left, right? Because in any Asian Development Outlook special theme chapter, although we usually produce about 10 to 15 research papers, right, to produce the special theme chapter, only about 5%, right, actually ends up in the special theme chapter. So we wondered what to do with this wealth of material, right, 95% that is left over. And what we decided to do with the wealth of material was to produce this ADB-Rutledge, joint ADB-Rutledge book entitled Inequality, Inclusive Growth, and the Fiscal Policy in Asia. So this book, of course, producing a book, right, especially by a reputable publisher such as Rutledge, takes quite some time. So even though this project was completed last March, around middle of March last year, this book came out only this year, April of this year. So it's about 6 months old. Anyway, just to simplify things for all of you, this title might be a little confusing. So I'll just give you a one-sentence summary, right, of what this book is all about, right? What does this book address? Well, this book addresses, the one-sentence summary of this book would be as follows: how Asia, or more precisely, developing Asia, can use or leverage fiscal policy to address or tackle or fight the region's growing income inequality problem. Okay? Or if you want to look at it, same thing, but a more positive spin on it would be how Asian countries can use fiscal policy to promote more inclusive growth, right? That promotes broader segments of the population rather than just a few rich, privileged elite. So moving right along. Okay, so actually this book was published in early June, but I just talked about the other elements here. So before I go into my main presentation, let me just briefly go over the contents of the book, okay? We start off with an overview chapter, right? For example, we motivate this study, why it matters, why it's important at this point in time, and so forth. And then the next chapter delves into the issue of fiscal space and the conventional wisdom that relative to other parts of the world, Asia has quite a lot of fiscal space, right? As a result, as a consequence of our tradition or history, if you will, of relatively responsible, sound fiscal policy in the past. In other words, we don't have any Greece or Venezuela or countries like that, right? By and large, in our part of the world. And then the third chapter is a highly technical econometric chapter. We look at the relationship, empirical relationship to be precise, between fiscal policy and not so much inequality, which is the central focus of our paper, but economic growth in Asia. Of course, economic growth is important for inequality, but indirectly, right? So this, but nevertheless, this is provides some important background information for our study. And the fourth chapter relates much more directly to the central theme of our chapter, because this chapter looks at the relationship between fiscal spending or government spending and income inequality in Asia. And it's also a highly technical chapter with a lot of econometrics. And then all of the chapters here, by the way, are Asia-wide chapters. In other words, Asia-wide studies, okay? But there's only one country-specific chapter, and that is this chapter. It looks at China, and more specifically, it looks at how government spending affects different income groups in China, okay? Of course, if government spends a lot of money, a lot on education, let's say, for example, but most of that education, public spending on education goes to the rich, then even if the government spends a lot, that certainly does not promote equality, right? In fact, it worsens inequality. For example, in countries like Brazil, in Latin America, on the other side of the world, Brazil invests quite a lot, Brazilian government, right, in education, has a relatively high ratio of public education spending to GDP ratio, but a lot of that spending actually goes to university rather than secondary school, primary school. So actually, yes, Brazilian government, to be precise, invests a lot in education, but that worsens inequality rather than helps to narrow inequality. I mean, the point here is, to be more specific, that money goes to upper middle income and even upper income kids, kids from Rio and Sao Paulo and so forth, rather than to the poorer, right? Students from poorer households in Brazil. Okay, and then the next, of course, that's one side of the fiscal coin, right? Fiscal policy has two sides. One side is government spending, and the second side, the other side, is how does government get the resources, right? Secure the resource. Of course, the main resource is through taxation, but there are also non-tax revenues. And that's what this chapter looks at. And then the next chapter is a forward-looking chapter. It examines fiscal spending, current levels of fiscal spending, current pattern of fiscal spending in Asia. Is it sustainable into the future? In other words, can Asia sustain that level of fiscal space going forward? That's what that chapter looks at. Of course, as I will talk about a little more shortly, Asia, right, is a relatively newcomer when it comes to using fiscal spending to fight inequality. We are relatively inexperienced in that effort, and governments traditionally in our part of the world have not used fiscal spending to redistribute income. Of course, in other parts of the world, governments have used fiscal policy to promote, to reduce income inequality, and including, of course, that's certainly true for rich countries, right? And Greece, so forth, some might say they've done too much of that. But anyway, they have an abundance of a wealth of experience there. But it's also true for Latin America, right? Which is much closer to us, right? In terms of income and development level. So from those experiences of both rich countries as well as our Latin American comparator countries, meaning countries which are, broadly speaking, at similar income and development levels with Asia, there are lessons to be learned, right? Both positive, what to do, and what not to do. Greece, right, for example. And last but not least, in this book, it's finally we have because we all have limited time, right? But you want to know what this book's about, what are the main findings, what are the main policy recommendations that are based on those key findings. You go to the very last chapter, which provides a nice summary of the main substance of the book. Now let me go to my presentation itself. And by the way, I will not be following this book, the structure of the book, but my presentation will be based on a narrative or storyline which I believe, right, brings out the key elements of this research project, right, rather than follow the structure of the book chapter by chapter. Okay, so let me begin by talking about why this study matters, why it's important, why at this particular point in time, Asian countries need to start seriously start thinking about something we haven't done a whole lot before, right? As I said, that is using fiscal policy to fight, address, or tackle inequality. So let me start with that. So I think, let me just start off with some stylized facts or conventional wisdom with which all of us are all too familiar, right? And that is simply this: Asia has done very well in terms of economic growth over the last 20 years, right? From between 1990 and 2010. So we have far outperformed the rest of the world in terms of economic growth rate, right? This is the blue dot, average, right? Average growth rate, far higher than Middle East, far higher than Latin America, and far higher than sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, that has yielded tremendous benefits. I mean, anybody who visits, who goes to Mumbai or Beijing, right, or Kuala Lumpur and all other Asian cities, they could not recognize Kuala Lumpur today, right, with what from somebody who visited 30 years ago, or somebody who visited Beijing today or Shanghai today would not recognize Shanghai today from the Shanghai they visited 30 years ago. And the same goes for Mumbai and other cities. So the point here is this economic growth has tremendously lifted our general living standards. Asians are much better fed, they wear much better clothes, they live in much nicer homes, and so forth. But I would say an equally important benefit of our sustained rapid growth. In other words, any country can grow a very nice rate for 1 or 2 years, but Asia has done it on a sustained basis, right? And that's the real point of the real remarkable feature, right, of the Asian miracle, right? As a result of a sustained rapid growth, we have been able to reduce poverty, right? In other words, people at the lower income end on a much greater scale than brown bar, right? This is our cumulative reduction in poverty over the last 20 years. Poverty defined the usual way, right? Households or individuals living at $1.25 or less per day, right? So much bigger reduction in poverty than Middle East, Latin America, and sub-Saharan Africa, right? So this kind of poverty reduction is actually historically quite unprecedented. It's a phenomenal achievement. It has lifted hundreds and hundreds of millions of Chinese, Indians, Asians out of poverty and onto more decent, humane, and productive lives. So that's remarkable and that's great. It's great. It's a tremendous achievement. But we are now facing a problem. I have to emphasize, it's not an Asia-specific problem by any stretch of the imagination. We are facing a global problem. It's a global problem. Asia is not exempt from this global problem. And that is the problem of growing inequality. Of course, Gini coefficient, right, as you probably know, is the most widely used measure, right, or index of income inequality. Higher Gini means inequality is worse, lower Gini, smaller Gini means inequality is narrower or better, if you will. So if you look at these countries, and these are these are countries with pretty big populations, some of them, right? China, India, Indonesia, Korea, and these are also countries at the very different income levels of income and development, from high income Korea to relatively low-income countries such as Bangladesh and Laos and many other countries in between. In any case, these countries collectively, jointly account for over 80% of developing Asia's population. And in these countries that account for the great majority of our region's population, Gini coefficient has risen. In other words, income inequality has worsened, right? I mean, I don't want to use as an economist, right, I'm very reluctant to use value-laden terms like improved or worsened, but I think it's almost a universal preference, right, that lower inequality is narrower inequality is better, right, than wider inequality. So at the risk of being a little imprecise and value-laden, let me just, to make it clearer for you, talk about income inequality improving and worsening and so forth. And again, this is something I have to emphasize. This is not an Asia-specific problem. It's a global problem. And there's so much global interest on this issue, right? Widening inequality. It also helps to explain why a highly technical book, right? A very economist book, not for the general lay reader, right? Or general audience book like, Capital in the 21st Century, right? Thomas Piketty, right? How a book like that could become a New York Times bestseller. That book, of course, looks at inequality, not in Asia, but inequality in rich countries, right? As I said, this problem of widening gap between the rich and the poor, or between the haves and have-nots, it's a global problem. And it's a global problem from which Asia is also suffering, as we can see. So the next obvious thing to ask is what to do about it. What should Asian countries do about that? First of all, note that there is growing demand from the Asian general public for the government to do something about it, as in other parts of the world, right? The Americans are asking their government, between these Wall Street fat cats and the average Joe, right, in Pittsburgh, income gap is becoming too wide. The government should do something about it. Likewise, in Asia, right, Asians too, right, understandably are asking their government to take some action, or at least to start thinking about taking some action. Although, of course, we are much poorer than the US. But in any case, similar type of growing, let's say, pressure or demand from the general public. And let's look at the international experience, and that experience, in other words, experience from other parts of the world, in particular rich countries, right? Because as I said earlier, they have a long history of using fiscal policy to fight inequality. And some of these countries, the role of the government, one might argue, is explicitly, primarily redistributionist. In other words, to make the division of the pie fairer, right? And Nordic countries, right, in particular, come to mind, right? When you think about that type of a highly redistributionist or equity-promoting fiscal policy. And that evidence abundantly, quite clear, in crystal clear terms, shows that yes, government spending can help to reduce narrow income inequality. But how about here in Asia? As I said earlier, we don't have that much experience, right, in this field. In other words, using fiscal policy to narrow inequality. And that is entirely understandable. That was entirely appropriate. Why? Because we were a very poor region, right? Up to 40, 30, 20 years ago. I mean, everybody's talking about the Asian century, China century, and so forth these days. But let's not get carried away. I mean, let's get back to reality. We still are a poor region, at least compared to the Europe and US. And certainly 40, 30, 20 years ago, we were a relatively low-income region. Although now we are an increasingly middle-income region. In other words, it's all very nice to talk for a country like Norway and Sweden and other rich countries to talk about dividing the pie more fairly. That's all very nice and good, but Asia, until quite recently, had no pie to divide. So quite rightfully, appropriately, understandably, the focus of public policy, including fiscal policy, was to expand the pie as much as possible, as fast as possible, as much as possible. So we do have a pie to divide. But increasingly, as a result of our tremendous, sustained, rapid economic growth, we've now become an increasingly middle-income region, right? Now, Asia has reached income levels where Asians do start thinking about, the quality of growth, not just growing as fast as possible. Of course, one key dimension of quality of growth is the environment, right? Growing in an environmentally sustainable way, growing in a way that does not destroy or harm the environment or deplete the environment. But another key dimension is precisely this, inclusive growth. In other words, the pie, to the extent possible, should be divided as fairly as possible. There should not be too much of a gap between the haves and have-nots, between the rich and the poor. We are at that income level now where people typically start thinking more about not just growing as fast as possible as we did in the past, but increasingly more, we're thinking more about quality of growth, including growing in a more equal way. In other words, not just growth for the sake of growth, but inclusive growth. And China's Harmonious Society Initiative is just one example, right, of that new evolution or change in Asian countries' thinking. So moving right along. So this is the dilemma that we are facing, right? Yes, it's realistically, if we want to use fiscal policy to address inequality, governments will have to spend government spending will have to at least increase somewhat. It's very nice and good to talk about, oh, we don't have to spend more, let's just cut fiscal waste, let's just spend more efficiently. All that is nice and fine, but realistically, if Asia is going to be serious about using fiscal policy to fight inequality, realistically, seriously, there will have to be at least some increase in government spending, right? So the question becomes, then that creates a dilemma though. How do we do that? How do we increase government spending to fight inequality in a way, okay, or without sacrificing our fiscal sustainability, fiscal space, fiscal responsibility, fiscal prudence that has served us so well in the past, and that is a tremendously valuable asset, right, for Asian countries. Of course, macroeconomic stability, fiscal balanced government budgets, or more or less balanced government budgets, right? That's a key ingredient of macroeconomic stability, which in turn is a key ingredient of sustained economic growth, right? Rapid economic growth. I mean, you don't see countries like banana republics like Venezuela or Argentina with hyperinflation and chronic macroeconomic instability rather, doing very well, right? Growing fast, right? So that's like the textbook, but let me just give you a more graphic example of how well, or rather, how valuable fiscal space is for us. 2008, 2009, right? Global financial crisis, boom. Everybody was saying about China. Oh, these Chinese guys, they're growing so fast, but they depend so much on exporting to the US, right? Since the global financial crisis, unlike most crises, it did not begin in some banana republic like Venezuela, Argentina. It started in the world's biggest country, right? In the US, the supposed anchor of the world economy and global financial stability. So because of that, when global financial crisis erupted, US economy went into recession, Europe and Japan also went into recession. Everybody said, oh, these Chinese guys, they're growing so fast, but they're growing so fast because they're exporting so much to the US. US economy is collapsing, so that means Chinese economy will collapse. Actually, the Chinese collapse never happened. It never happened for a very good reason. It never happened because of China's 13% of GDP fiscal stimulus over 2 years. That's not 1 year, it's 2 years, but it's still massive. That helped support China's growth. In retrospect, even in the worst year of global financial crisis, 2008, I believe, in terms of global growth, China, in retrospect, right, looking back at it, China grew by an astonishing growth rate. If you think over 7%, how was China able to do that? Because it had fiscal space, right? Because the government unleashed a powerful, massive fiscal stimulus. That benefited China, obviously, but it also benefited many Asian countries, including Korea, Thailand, and many other countries that trade a lot, right? That has close economic linkages with China, Malaysia, Taipei, China, and so forth. So the question is, the critical issue is, yes, if we want to use fiscal policy to fight inequality, governments have to spend more. But how to do that without sacrificing, without compromising fiscal space, fiscal responsibility, fiscal prudence that served us tremendously well, right, in the past. And that will continue to serve us well going forward. Because fiscal space, it enables governments to act when they really have to act, when something like the mother of all crises, right, global financial crisis erupts. That's when governments really need to do something in terms of government spending. Okay, so now let me move to the second part. And here I look at the one side of the fiscal policy equation. As I said, there are two sides to fiscal policy, right? Spending and how to finance that spending. In other words, taxes and other revenues. But I start with spending, government spending. I start with government spending for a reason. I could have gone the other way, right, obviously. I could have started with taxes and revenues, number 2 and number 3, spending. But I do this for a reason, and that reason is this. The evidence, right, evidence from rich countries clearly shows, very, very clearly shows, from empirical econometric, rigorous econometric studies, and there have been quite a few, that the balance of evidence quite clearly shows government spending, right, is much more effective than taxation. For example, progressive taxation, right, taxing the rich at a much higher rate than the poor, right, is much more effective than taxation and revenue policies in reducing income inequality. There's a clear evidence on that. And then we did a study, well, actually my colleagues, my colleague Iris Klaus, she has since left ADB and joined another international financial institution. But in any case, she did a study and then she reconfirms that, econometrically reconfirming that is also true for developing Asia. In other words, spending seems to have a bigger, more significant impact on fighting, reducing income inequality than taxation and revenue policies. So, okay, taxation, spending, government spending more important than taxation and in reducing income inequality. So does that mean taxation and revenue policy is not important or irrelevant for inclusive growth or irrelevant for fighting inequality? Of course, far from it, right? Why? Because yes, you have healthcare, public spending on healthcare, public spending on education, public spending on social transfers, right? Cash transfers to the poor and so forth that help to fight inequality. But if Asia doesn't want to become like Venezuela, Argentina, that has to be financed, right? That has to be financed and financed responsibly. That's where revenues come in, right? That's where taxation come in. So public spending is more important for fighting, has a bigger impact on reducing inequality than taxation. That does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that taxation and revenue policies are not important for fighting inequality. Because these kinds of equity promoting, inequality reducing, fiscal spending at the end of the day has to be financed, and it has to be financed in a responsible way. Okay, so we did some, without getting into the technical detail, this is clearly an econometric simulation, but this is, let me just briefly explain in non-technical terms what this is. This is year 1, year 2, year 3, and this is how the Gini coefficient, right, measure of inequality responds to a one-off increase in public spending on education. Government spends more on education, what happens to inequality, right? That's what we simulated. And then quite clearly, government spending helps to reduce the Gini coefficient. It helps to reduce income inequality, right, over time, up to 6 years. This diagram shows our results for education. I did not reproduce the diagram for healthcare, but it's qualitatively similar. It has an impact, right? It helps to reduce government spending on healthcare, and it also helps to reduce income inequality. Of course, education, something like education and healthcare, or government spending on education and healthcare, it's very easy to justify. It's very to defend. I mean, even intellectually, commonsensically, because if you think about it, government spends more on education. That's good for equity, right? Because the poor benefit more from public schools than the rich. The rich always have the option, right? And many use that option of sending their kids to private school, right? And the same goes for hospitals. The poor, so public spending on education and healthcare clearly it's good for equity, right? But it's also clearly good for economic growth. So really, it doesn't impose much of a trade-off, right, between the two, if you think about it, right? Because it helps to expand human capital, right? Both of them, right? But of course, of course, there is going to be some trade-off, especially when we talk about transfers, right? Giving money, right? Cash handouts to the poor and other targeted subsidies, for example, fuel subsidies. And of course, we need that. And then I didn't reproduce the graph here, but these kind of targeted subsidies and transfers, they have the biggest impact, right, on reducing income inequality. But of course, you have to do it. Giving subsidies to the poor is fine, but it has to be targeted. I mean, there are some scandalous, right, truly scandalous examples of subsidies that are meant to help the poor, or at least that is their supposed or alleged objective. But actually, most of the benefits, right, actually go to the middle class and above, right? For example, Indonesia, although Indonesia is reforming its fuel subsidy, as is Malaysia, most of that subsidy went to this upper middle income guy in Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur driving this SUV. So that kind of fuel subsidy, it's really hard to see how that kind of fuel subsidy helps to reduce income inequality. It probably makes it worse. So next question, ADB, as many of you who know ADB probably know, we are an infrastructure bank, right? We build power plants, we build roads, we build ports and so forth, right? Most of our lending or operation is on infrastructure. Of course, there's another, by the way, infrastructure, international multilateral development bank. That's an infrastructure bank in Asia, right? This, what is it? Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? It's created by China, right, recently. But in any case, we are also an infrastructure bank. And so the question becomes, how about infrastructure? Does infrastructure spending, government spending more on roads and power plants and communication systems and so forth, does that help to reduce income inequality? No, we do not find a significant effect. But we do find, as do many other studies, yes, that it does help to boost economic growth. It does not seem to have a significant effect on reducing income inequality, but it does seem to have and this is just echoing many other studies that find a positive impact of government spending on infrastructure on economic growth. And of course, economic growth, if it's sustained, right, can help to reduce poverty and reduce inequality, although the link is much more tenuous there. Okay, moving right. So what is the problem? The problem is this. This is how much Asian governments spend on education, blue bar. And this is brown bar is Latin America. How much a Latin American government spend on education as a share of GDP. And then this is rich countries, right? As I said, some of you might scratch us. Latin America spends more on education than Asia, because we all know that Asia invests heavily, right, in education, and Asian parents, right, Chinese, Indian, Korean, all these Asian parents are very education focused, right, care a huge amount, right, about the education of their children, which is a good thing, right? But so, of course, but this is, keep in mind, this is government spending, right? Public spending on education. Asian parents spend huge amounts of private money, right, on education. Not only that, as I said earlier, the Brazilian example, yes, Brazil invests hugely, or if you will, splurges on Brazilian governments, right, on education. A lot of that goes to your upper middle income kids from Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and the other upper middle income and above kids going to universities, right? And these are university tuition, which they probably can afford, right? Even without government help. So it's really hard to see how that helps to reduce income inequality. How about healthcare? Again, we not only lag the rich countries, OECD countries, but we also lag Latin America. And likewise, for pensions and other social protection, we not only lag the rich countries again, but we also lag Latin America, which is broadly speaking at similar income and development level as Asian countries. Well, not only that, the spending seems to benefit the rich more than the poor. So this is a group of low middle income and low income, well, Indonesia is middle income, but countries, anyway, a sample of selected Asian countries. And then the children from the poorest 20% households, the blue, are much more likely to drop out of secondary school and hence not benefit from government spending on secondary schools, okay? And another example of this kind of a benefit incident. By benefit incidents, I mean who gets the benefits? Who benefits, right, from public spending, right, on these various programs? For example, this is from the China, that one country-specific study that we did, right, on China. And that is that is from that paper and that chapter in the book. But anyway, this is a public pension spending. Of course, when you're young, right, you get zero pension, but you get pension when you get old. Richest 25%, poorest 25%, and maybe the color selection is not that good. But anyway, you can see the point. There's this monstrous gap, right, between public pension spending on the richest 25% and the poorest 25%. The point is not there is a big gap. Even in rich countries, even in OECD countries, there's a big gap, right? Because the rich pay much more into the pension system, right, than the poor. So obviously there is a gap. But the point of this graph is not that there is a gap, or not that there's a big gap, but that this gap is so monstrously big. Because in rich countries, or even in Latin American countries, the gap would be much smaller because governments have in place some programs, such as social pensions, non-contributory pensions, right, that help the poor, right? So yes, there will be a big gap, even in rich countries, but that gap will be nowhere near as this big. It will be significantly smaller, although still quite big. So again, another matter is how about the nature of spending, right? That clearly matters, right, for how much fiscal policy can reduce inequality. For example, governments investing in education of children from poor households, maybe it's a good idea to strengthen technical and vocational education. That I think also should be strengthened for Korea for different reasons. But in any case, in poor countries, a technical and vocational education for children from poor households should be strengthened so that they have, right, the skills, right? So that they don't end up with a piece of paper, right, that doesn't really give them any skills, right, to be productive and valuable in the marketplace, right? Likewise, in terms of public spending on health, why not spend the last public dollar on healthcare on some remote rural area with no clinic rather than providing some state-of-the-art medical equipment for the urban upper middle class, right? In other words, why not build a clinic in Irian Jaya, right, which is the remotest part of Indonesia, rather than some fancy medical equipment for a Jakarta clinic, let's say. Okay, that's one side of the equation. Let's move to the other side now, taxation and and revenues, right? I think I have 5 more minutes, so I have to speed it up. But okay, let's go. So there is this conventional wisdom. Asia has a lot of fiscal space, and evidence seems to support that, right? At least to some extent. This is developing Asia. In other words, government debt relative to GDP. That ratio is lower for developing Asia, us, than it is for Latin America. We are fiscally healthier. It's lower than the world. We are fiscally healthier. It's lower than rich countries, OECD countries. We are fiscally healthier, right? So there does seem to be some truth to this conventional wisdom that Asia, right, is in relatively good fiscal shape. But keep in mind, fiscal space today does not mean fiscal space tomorrow, right? Think about it. We ran some simple but quite nice, if I may say, simulations, and it looked at 2 things. It has 2 drivers: population aging and per capita income. So very intuitive. As countries grow older, there's going to be more demand for some kind of government programs. Healthcare is clearly, obviously one, right? Pension is another, right? And as countries grow richer, people typically demand more and better public services. That's why rich countries, the government, right, as share of GDP, typically much higher than in middle income. Europe, US, and I mean Europe in particular, but also US and Japan, right, to a lesser extent. Because it's a well-known stylized fact. When countries grow richer, typically people, citizens, right, demand more and better governments. So the government's relative government size tends to expand. So just these two factors, demographics, population aging, and per capita GDP, countries grow. So in simple English, as countries grow richer, they demand more and better public services, number one. Number two, as countries grow older, they demand more and better public service. Not all, but some public service. Healthcare is obviously one, right? So this is what these are Asia sub-regions, India and its India and its neighbors, China and its neighbors, ASEAN, and so Kazakhstan and the Fiji and these countries. But this is Asia as a whole. This is actual numbers. This is what Asian governments spend on healthcare as a share of GDP. 2010. This is what we are projected to spend according to our simulation, and it's a much bigger number, right? So again, fiscal space today does not necessarily mean fiscal space tomorrow. And then we do the same thing for Social Security, pensions and other forms of Social Security, same general pattern. We spend only this much, actual number. And 5 years ago, this is what we will spend in 2050. These are very simple simulations, but there is a result that gives us a measure of confidence and credibility, in the credibility and robustness of the simulation, and that is this. I didn't put that graph here, but we did the same kind of exercise for education. And for education, of course, you have opposing effects, right? Because just think of it, common sense. Countries grow richer, again, that's same, right? They demand more and better education, public education. But as countries grow older, they demand less education, right? Because education is for younger people, right? And the younger the population, right? The bigger, right? The demand for education. So what do you know? We repeated this exercise for not social, but public spending on education. And in fact, what we found was this. For 2050, government spending on education will be slightly, not by a large amount, but slightly smaller than it was in 2010. So in other words, the population aging effect seems to dominate the Asia growing richer effect, right? By a small margin. But anyway, the point is that kind of very commonsensical, intuitive, plausible result gives us some measure of confidence in these simulations, as simple as they were, right? These are not fancy, high-powered, high-tech simulations by any stretch of the imagination. But it does, as I said, generate pretty believable results. Okay, but forget 35 years from now. Forget 2050. Let's look at today. Even today, we collect much less taxes as a share of GDP, not only relative to rich countries, not only relative to the world, but also relative to our main comparator region, Latin America. Of course, one might argue immediately, but that's precisely why we grew so fast. Our tax rate is low, that gives firms to incentive more, that the workers get to keep more of their salary, so they work harder, and so on. And all of that's nice and fine, but that's really not, we are not talking about tax rate here, right? When we say Asia collects too few taxes, Asia should be doing much better, Asia should be collecting much more taxes. What we are talking about here is something much more fundamental than that. For example, I made a similar presentation last year for the ADO theme chapter, not the book. The book wasn't out in Bangkok, right, at the UNESCAP, right? And then the director, the research director, there was a Pakistani gentleman, and said, oh, I agree with what you're saying. And he gave a very nice graphic example. Pakistan, right? The gentleman was Pakistani. He said, in Pakistan, they're like, I forgot the exact number, but 20 million people who should be paying personal income taxes, right? In other words, upper middle income and above people, right, in Karachi, Lahore, and so forth, right? The number that actually pay personal income tax was like 100,000. So that's the sense I'm talking about, that Asia should be doing a much better job of collecting taxes. I'm not talking about Asia should jack up its tax rate to Nordic levels or even significantly higher levels. Okay, and it's true that Asia needs to do better across all different tax categories. Social contribution, property taxes, indirect taxes, corporate income taxes, personal income taxes. There's significant scope for improvement across all tax revenue categories. So there are a number of things that we can do to collect more revenues so we can finance government programs that help to promote inclusive growth, broadening the tax base for personal income tax, VAT, using sin taxes and non-tax revenues, expanding taxes that are naturally progressive. For example, property tax, right? The rich own $1 million homes, the poor own $10,000 homes, right? So you tax it, even if you tax it the same rate, it's naturally progressive. And last but not least, especially in low income and low middle income countries in our region, for example, Pakistan, right, which I talked about, there's this tremendous need to improve tax administration, which will lead to higher tax revenue collection. For example, through a technological innovation such as introducing ICT. But one note of caution is introducing ICT, of course that's a good idea, but in and of itself, that will do very little to boost tax collection, because you need to combine that with better governance. In other words, governance reforms. So something like ICT, when combined, not in and of itself, just making an online portal or whatever, that's going to do nothing to improve tax collection in the country. But if you improve that with better governance, through governance and institutional reform, of course, that can make a powerful difference. Okay, so broadening the tax base. For example, relative to OECD, our threshold is too high, right? We need too much high, so we need to expand the number of taxpayer base. Even when it's too high, as I said, even then, far too people actually pay taxes. Far too few companies actually pay taxes. So this is an interesting study that we did at ADB. Sin taxes, right? This is a study we did for the Philippines. Sin taxes means tax on a sin, right? Or suppose it's like drinking and smoking and so forth. This was a study on cigarette tax in the Philippines. And something like a cigarette tax, or more generally sin tax, yields two benefits, right, from textbook. One is the obvious one. It's a source of revenue for the government. It's valuable. Number two, it's also efficient because it helps to reduce a negative externality, right? Reduce the amount of smoking, reduce the amount of getting drunk and disorderly conduct and other harm to other people, right? It reduces the negative externality, so it's efficient. But what this study found, what this study on cigarette tax in the Philippines found was it may have even a third benefit, not just double dividend, but triple dividend, and that it may be good for equity, because this is where is it? The low income people, right? Blue bar, right? Low, middle income, high income. This is the individual cost of the cigarette tax. This is individual benefit, health benefit. And the net benefit seems to be disproportionately higher for the poor. Maybe the intuition is the poor tend to smoke more than the middle income and the rich upper income groups. Okay, finally, just a couple of closing remarks, if I may. One is that we need to explicitly, Asian countries need to at least start thinking about explicitly incorporating fiscal objectives, in other words, equity objectives into their medium-term fiscal framework. Of course, that has to be subordinate to the bigger goal of fiscal sustainability, but we really need to explicitly, systematically, institutionally incorporate equity objectives into our fiscal policy. In other words, let's don't just, let's say, every time a food riot by poor people break out in some Asian city, whether it's in India or China or Indonesia or Nepal, there's a riot, food riot by the poor, or governments, we have to give some cash handouts or food handouts. That's random, right? That's not systematic. That's not strategic. Let's don't do it like that. Let's explicitly bring in equity objectives into fiscal policy. Of course, you need good data, fiscal data for that, which many countries don't have. But that's at least something for Asian governments, even in poorer Asian countries, to start thinking about. And the second one is, where is it? There's also some need for innovation. For example, let me just touch upon one. Asia does huge amount of public-private partnership, right? PPP, and I think Korea is one of the leading countries in that. So many developing countries actually come to learn, right, from KDI, which has a whole center, right, dedicated to this PPP. So, but all of that, the vast majority of that is actually hard infrastructure, right? Roads, power plants. So one possible idea, actually this is easy, again, easier said than done, but it's at least something for governments to think about. Why don't we extend this idea of bringing in private capital? Because governments are fiscally squeezed as it is, their budgets are tight as it is, and form public-private partnerships for social area, for social spending, such as schools and clinics and hospitals and so forth. Of course, that has the benefit of more capital, right, into these kind of areas, right? That's good for equity. But it also, in many cases, by introducing competition, it helps to improve efficiency, quality, right? Quality of the services. And at the end of the day, who benefits the most, again, from better, not just more, but better public school, better public clinics, and better hospital? It's the poor, right? They don't have the option. They don't have the luxury of private schools or private clinics or private hospitals. I think that's it. Okay.